One of the most consistent questions that we're plagued by was, if racism is so prevalent, where is the data? And we got tired of hearing that question.
It's That's Lit with me, Shazzy D, and it's a special episode of That's Lit today because we are going to be talking about a new platform that was released just this year called the Racism Register. It was co-founded by Elizabeth Lang and Elizabeth Tekanyo, who are joining me on the show today. Hello and welcome to you both.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon.
Starting off, can you just explain what the Racism Register is and how it works?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I will also just start by mentioning that there is a register called Call It Out, which is specifically designed for First Nations people. And that was launched 3 years ago, I believe, on the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And ours was launched 3 years later. I guess the Racism Register is the first open platform in Australia that, collects data on incidents of racism experienced by anybody. And so I just like to start by kind of mentioning that. Now, the Racism Register, and feel free to jump in, Liz, was co-founded by myself and my co-founder, Elizabeth Tekanyo. We've done work together over the last 5 years, delivering anti-racism training across Australia, mainly in Western Australia, but we've also done some work across other states and internationally. And one of the most consistent questions that we're plagued by was, if racism is so prevalent, where is the data? And we got tired of hearing that question. So that kind of sowed some of the seeds for the register in terms of, because we know that the evidence is out there, but there isn't, I guess, an easily accessible platform for community members to be able to share their experiences of racism, or for others who might witness racism happening to somebody else to be able to record that. I guess the second part of the reason we started it, aside from our professional work around anti-racism training delivery, we've got lived experience around the issues of racism in different ways, and Liz will speak to her own experience. But for me, as a Black woman who's lived most of my life in Australia, I started school in year 4. I've obviously experienced these things and continue to experience racism, but I think particularly for me, what was the kind of the point where I just had enough was when, my kids have experienced racism over many years, but last year got particularly bad with my now 9-year-old daughter. She was only 8 at the time. And it was just horrific, the things that she had been through. And it was really disappointing because for years as a mom, even though I understand the system inside out, even though I've grown up here, trying to fight for her, it was like talking to a brick wall when I was trying to engage with schooling staff and with teachers who were so adamant on denying or minimizing it. And it was, as you can imagine, very painful as a mom, because I think if I ever felt most disempowered in my life, it was when it came to my children's experiences and feeling like, despite all this knowledge and all this experience, I can't save this child from this situation. And that was really difficult for me. So that had another huge impact also, because I know that in Australia, there's such a silencing around racism, and that's one of the biggest barriers. It's almost like, not almost, people think it's more offensive to be called a racist than the actual act of racism itself. And I think a part of that is that because there's kind of a deafening silence around racism, which is, as I've said, a barrier that leads to then further denial. There's not enough, I guess, data and stories to create mass social change. And what Liz and I have set out to do with the register is to be able to shift the national dialogue around racism, to make it okay for people to talk about racism in the same manner that people recognize that at the root of gender inequality is patriarchy. For example, there's no arguments about that. But the same is not true when we talk about racism. No one wants to admit that at the root of that is white supremacy. And that's what's actually driving, the racism that we see. It's what's driving the fear in the community and all of these issues. So there's a few elements to the register, obviously collecting data, but also wanting to create social change and have dialogue around racism. But Liz, please weigh in as well.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You definitely covered most of it. But just to reiterate that Elizabeth and I met about 5 years ago. We're both doing our PhDs consistently, slowly, painfully, but doing our PhDs. We're migrant mothers. And my story is more around that I'm in an interracial relationship with a brown child who is not yet in school. He's a toddler, but already starting to see around the various microaggressions that he faces, as well as the more overt racism that my husband faces. Want to also note that we're on our land in Perth, Western Australia. And just to really highlight that we're very much so with the Racism Register sitting alongside First Nations peoples and understanding that there are various forms of racism affecting various communities. And so we're very much so in solidarity between the migrant refugee communities and the First Nation and non-First Nation communities. I think the other comment, just to reiterate that it was a few months ago, probably September, October, that Liz and I were having conversations, and we just really got to a point of being fed up. We went through the whole evolution working together in the DEI space with, calling trainings, whatever was most comfortable to that white organization. So cultural competency, cultural inclusion, cultural diversity, and really kind of bending over backwards in ways in which to go around using the term racism, and particularly the term anti-racism, in organizations and spaces, and tiptoeing around the issue in order to get the job, because it was hard enough just to have a major corporation sign off on even a tick box training, which we know doesn't work, and we know there needs to be a holistic approach. So that alongside coupled with organizations coming to us saying either that they're being reactive because an employee made a comment or made an overt racist action that led to media exposure, or they were being proactive, but oftentimes that was hidden, reactive, that they just hadn't told us what was really going on in the organization. So with that and our personal experiences, we came to this realization that although DEI is seen as trying to change soft skills or soft experiences, there's really hard consequences of what people are experiencing in the workplace and in society in general. And we had so many, particularly in one training, Black women who were just talking to us about their experiences, and the outcome is always just having to quit or being terminated or something like that. And it just got to a point where we put that line in the sand. This also follows a lot of the major movements that we are, again, we're advocates and in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the fact that that movement was really built on the collective but tragic experiences of George Floyd and other Black Americans who lost their lives to racism. We are building upon that narrative to now be able to capture the everyday experiences, so on a mass scale. So looking at the future of what does crowdsourced data look like, and how can we use crowdsourced data for good and to create a movement for systemic change.
How exactly does it work? So is it just a way for people to go in and put in the incident that happened to them most recently?
The register works through the website. If you go to www.racismregister.org, on the homepage, you'll see a link, a call to action, where you can actually click, and it will take you directly to the register. Basically what it is, so it's really up to the individual how it is that they're wanting to, I guess, log their experiences. Some might want to share because obviously with racism, it's rarely one incident. It's usually like, a lot of the time you can't even remember the many, because there's also, it shows up in various forms. So people can either log one, like an incident of something that maybe is front of mind for them, or they can log one that is, I guess, includes a number of incidences. We've designed it so a lot of it can be tick box to minimize, I guess, the burden on the person when they're completing it, because we recognize obviously it is a sensitive topic, and it's not something that it can be very upsetting and quite traumatic, kind of rehashing, the experience to document. But so it's a lot of tick boxes. People can also put in like a qualitative response where they can share the narrative, but that's also optional as well. So yes, they can log either one incident or a series of incidents. They can, log one incident that's happened, but then they can come back and log something else if something else has come up. So that's a huge part of the register. Also, just mention that because of I guess, the trauma associated with racism, we recognize that racial trauma is obviously real. And what we've done in terms of the design is we've engaged a therapist who specializes in racial trauma to help us with the questions. We actually reviewed the entire register, question by question. And Associate Professor Kithomi Gatwiri. And so she assisted with reviewing the register, the questions, and kind of tweaking to ensure that they are racial trauma informed, because it can be quite lengthy, depending on obviously on how much detail one wants to provide.
Liz, if you want to maybe take this one, which is, I guess, what happens after? So someone has written, maybe their experience or something that's happened, in the past. Where does that information go? What happens next?
Yeah, so it's a platform to collect data, obviously, to drive the evidence, the hard evidence needed for change on a systemic level, but also on an individual level. It's to be used how is best beneficial to the individual. So someone might just want to share their story, and that to them is the way that they want to get that experience shared and off their chest. Other people might want to actually link in with some of our services and support networks that we're building. So we're building a partnership with the Racial Justice Center, for example, so that if someone does want to access free and low bono legal support to take their case further, for example, they can. And then we're just trying to break down barriers as kind of like a triage service for people to get more help if they so choose. We also are looking at racial, as Liz sort of alluded to, racial trauma-informed counseling, even potentially PR support as well if people want to go more public with their story. But it's a grassroots movement and it's kind of forever growing and changing. And the cool part about it is that we have people contacting us every day with different ideas or different requests. And so it's kind of morphing as we go, but it's been very interesting these first few weeks post-launch.
Great. Oh, that's good. Okay, just going off what you just said, Liz, in terms of the response. So have people so far, I know it's kind of early days, maybe I could say, so to speak, but has there been maybe a positive response so far to it?
Yeah, we've had a couple hundred people access the register and we've gained a couple hundred followers. We have a couple thousand people who've come onto the website to check us out, and just so much support, which we were actually surprised about. We thought we were going to have a lot more initial hate going on, but just the widespread grassroots support has been amazing. And then we've had coming close to 50 reports so far. Now, we are volunteer and we are currently not funded. We're doing this all between our day jobs and being full-time moms. So as we gain more following and we get more funding, we're hoping, and donations, we're hoping that we can spread the word faster and be accessible to a wider group of people.
Great. And now, Elizabeth, maybe if you can take this one. It's just more broadly. So if you could talk about what the, I guess, outcomes you're hoping for with this register, maybe, policymakers or, researchers, what do you hope they can get out of this?
So I think broadly speaking, as I alluded to earlier, we're wanting to shift the silence around racism in Australia. That's one of our biggest aims. And we aim to do that, as Liz said, as we get more funding to be able to, I guess, amplify the message more. We'll be able to achieve that through campaigns on social media, for example, things that really kind of spark people to think. And like if you think of like a meme that you come across and you go, oh, and you kind of go through your day and it keeps coming back to you. So we're wanting to do things that really spark everyday conversations where everyday people can see themselves in various scenarios and think, what would I do if that happened, in my presence, or how could I respond differently if I was in that scenario? So that's a huge part of it. Because we are collecting the data daily, the plan is that we'll be publishing yearly reports that will be publicly available through the website, but we'll also be sharing those directly with relevant government departments, for example, and various institutions to drive systemic change. It will also be publicly available to any member of the public, and researchers as well are able to use the data for their own research purposes. So I think for us, it's really important that the information is accessible. I know there are organizations that collect data and then gatekeep on who can access, etc. We're not interested in that because a part of the problem is that there isn't enough collaboration happening. And I think with an issue like racism, and to be able to create the kind of shift that we're wanting to create, we're very intentional about ensuring that we're publishing yearly, that it is publicly available and accessible to researchers, to policymakers to influence policy change, but also to be used, I guess, as tools for advocacy as well, because data is powerful. It's very hard to drive systemic change or any kind of meaningful policy change without the data or the evidence base to speak to why there is a need for a change in the first place. So I think with the register, and particularly with the reports, what we're hoping to do is to be able to tick a few boxes. As Liz mentioned about the stories that we're also collecting, people have the option to either they can say whether they're okay with their story being shared publicly. And so with the ones who indicate that they're fine with that, we'll be using those stories as part of the kind of awareness raising campaigns, as well as like kind of bite-sized narratives and things that people can access through various means. So yeah.
What I thought was interesting about it, because I had a quick look, I went to the website and had a look at it, and it's not just like you mentioned, Elizabeth, it's not just you yourself if something happened to you, but it's also for someone who may be a bystander, someone who's witnessing an incident that happened to somebody else. I wanted to also ask why that's important also to give an opportunity for others, whoever else is standing there and has witnessed something, to also then report, say what they've seen.
I think in our trainings, we're very intentional about having a white trainer and a black trainer doing the teaching and the education. I love working with Elizabeth. She and I are cut from the same cloth. We have 10 out of 10 of the characteristics for crazy entrepreneurs. But I think, yeah, that intentional visibility of that, the idea that it's everyone's responsibility and that white people in Australia need to also speak up, that silence is complicity. And by making racism everybody's problem, we thus we can all come together to find a solution. And so that's why we're quite intentional about, having a white and a black female co-founders, as well as having the racism register being open to people experiencing and people witnessing of all colors.
I guess I also just, my own curiosity, because I I've also gone through some racist incidents. I think it's it's a situation where you don't really know what to do. That's just based on my own experience. Something happens to you, and what's next? There's no, I guess, handbook on the exact steps because there's so many different forms. And I think, Elizabeth, you said, sometimes you don't even remember, or it happens so quickly, or it's so sudden. Why is it important that we do have something like this? And even the register you mentioned before for, Indigenous Australians, that it's already there. But why is it so important to have such a platform here in Australia?
I think it's important to have the platform because while the stories and the experiences are out there, if they're not being collected, they kind of don't exist. In the sense that when we're talking about racism as a systemic issue, the first question is, well, where's the data? Where's the proof? How do we know this is not just you anecdotally sharing your own, experiences? And just about every Black or brown person I've spoken to in this country has experienced something. So we know it's prevalent. We know it's everywhere. We know it's common. So I think for us, by collecting the data, we're bringing visibility to the issue of racism. We're saying it's real, it's out there. And we're not just saying that because, I think so, but here is the data. Here is, the voices from the community. Here is what people are saying. Here is a number of incidents we've received this year. Here's a number of people who've witnessed it, who have said, I've seen something horrific and I'm reporting this. So data makes the invisible visible. And that's why the register is really powerful. It's also really powerful because, as you've said, usually these things catch you off guard. You're not prepared. Like you're going about your day, you're shopping at Kohl's, you're just, you're at work, you're doing your everyday things, and then something hits you, and you're kind of like, sometimes afterwards you go, oh, I should have said, or I should have done, or I should have, we all have those experiences. But I think the nature of racism is such that obviously it can come at any moment from anywhere. And sometimes it's very overt, sometimes very covert. Sometimes it's like microaggressions. So then you start questioning yourself, is it just me overanalyzing? Or did they intend it to come across that way, etc.? But I think for us, it's to also validate to people that your experiences are real, that they are valid, and that they deserve to be known about. Because it's only when these things come to the fore that we're able to actually drive any kind of change around the issue of racism in Australia. Until then, we'll forever talk about the prevalence of racism, but then we always fall back on, well, there's no evidence base, so therefore, where is the incentive to do something, or where is the pressure for government to even to create policies that address these issues if there's no evidence base to back that up? So we see that as kind of the beginnings of creating mass social change, but also of and part of that is kind of the dialogue piece around normalizing conversations around racism in Australia, where people, even saying the word race or racism becomes norm. Because now just saying racism, people like freeze up and get awkward, and I think that's a huge part of the problem that makes it difficult for not only people with lived experience to share their own experiences, but also for allies and anyone who witnesses something to actually speak about it, because there is that kind of awkward silencing that surrounds it. Yeah.
Anything else you want to add, Liz?
Just going back to some of the comments of like the future of crowdsourced data. I'm originally from the Silicon Valley and follow a lot of tech founders, and I think, envision a future where we are able to really not only have direct reports on our platform, but also really magnify people's stories and experiences on digital spaces to really create a widespread movement, a digital movement, and digital platform for people with a safety framework that they can access in terms of support, which wasn't the case, for example, with the Me Too movement, where women came forward to share their stories for advocacy, but then oftentimes were thrown under the bus, as an example. And I think that the iteration of that following is to be able to also recognize the history of Black and Brown communities and data collection and research being quite harmful at times. So by being able to directly and hopefully in real time as technology evolves and we use more AI and other ways to directly communicate back with community, as well as show trends in real time, show types in real time, and so it's not just necessarily a one-time yearly report, but actually is a true growing and morphing platform in real time, as well as using technology to start really going back to communities, to online, to look at what works and what doesn't work in terms of anti-racism. So that's the other side of it, is actually dismantling the system.
Great. It has been such a pleasure talking to you both. I really appreciate you coming on, explaining the platform and what it aims to achieve. And I really hope it has some really positive outcomes as you keep using it, keep getting the word out there about it. So thanks so much for joining me on the show today, Elizabeth Lang and Elizabeth Tekanyo.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.